So real briefly, I'm going to skim these topics: system requirements, sessions, device access protocols, protocol interfaces, application execution, AC admin tool, auditing, workgroup manager, remote home folders, directory service integration, and application installation. I'm going to go real briefly over some of these. The main reason why they're included here on the slide deck is for you to be able to view later on. Real briefly, system requirements, we talk about 2 core minimum. It's important to note for optimization purposes, the more cores, the better. So if you had a choice between 4 cores or 8 cores versus having 4 cores at 3 gigahertz, hypothetically speaking, or 8 cores at 2 gigahertz, hypothetically speaking, then it's better to choose the 8 core. Using more cores is more preferred versus using less cores. Xeon processors are preferred. We're actually fine-tuned and optimized for them. So the Intel Core 2 Duos, for example, which are found on the iMacs and the MacBook Pros and things of that nature, will work with us, but we end up having to use software routines for some of our functions, and so therefore it actually reduces performance. Again, we're tuned for the Mac Pro and Excerpt hardware. As a matter of fact, we don't support any other hardware, so if you were to call in for technical support questions that we're reflecting with the server being on anything besides a Mac Pro or an Excerpt, we don't support that. Display or console, we prefer you to run the server headless. There are some security aspects to worry about. When you run things on the server actually logged in, people who are logged in via like SSH and things of that nature can actually run applications and interact with the console. So we recommend, because the server is going to be more widely exposed to the users, you leave the console basically disconnected headless, and you leave it at the login prompt. Therefore, it reduces the possible attack vectors. This is not an Aqua Connect problem or security vulnerability. This is just general security consciousness here. Memory, we require about 0.5 gig of memory for the base operating system of the operating system of the Mac OS X and Aqua Connect itself. So even though the Mac OS X environment recommends 1 gig of memory or more, with the 1 gig that is included, you can always get multiple user sessions right off of that bat. Performance won't be great, but it'll function. Minimum requirement that we recommend is 128 megs of RAM. That's 1/8 of a gigabyte. You can get away with 64 megs of RAM if you're going to do something very simple, such as like the Safari calculator text edit type situation. So 64 megs of RAM is for the minimum. We try to shy away from that, from the simple fact that we'd like you to throw more memory at the problem if possible. Applications, the first user to run an application will take up the entire amount of memory that that application would normally take up. So, for example, if you're running an application, we'll call it ABC, for example. If ABC were to run and ABC were to take 1 gig of RAM, the first user to run that would take 1 gig of RAM on the system. Now, keep in mind, besides CPU being shared and disk being shared across the users, memory is also pooled together and shared across the user sessions. So, that being said, the first user will take up the full amount of memory. But an interesting thing that we have with optimization is we reuse the execution code in such a way that when the second, third, and fourth, and upteenth user connects the system and runs that application, they'll take approximately 1/4, or even quite often a lot less than 1/4 of the amount of memory. So the second user will take up, in this case, 256 megs of RAM. If you take an application like Adobe Creative Suites, this applies to be correct. If you take an application such as Microsoft Office, we find that we take about 1/8 of that memory for each second, third, and fourth, and so forth user. So we save memory, we optimize memory by the number of users running. Let's talk about storage real briefly. We recommend about 100 megabytes of storage for Aqua Connect to run in its normal environment. We create a lot of temporary files and do a lot of temporary stuff, so 100 megabytes is pretty quick and easy. We also recommend about 50 megabytes of free space for each user. That's in addition to their home folder and things of that nature. That's, again, because of temporary stuff that we do. Each user must have a home directory and must be accessible by the server. So if you have directory services, you must actually have the home folder and be able to have access to it from the server. Now, we have an article on our website that describes how to test that. Most people who set up directory services set it up correctly, but about 10 to 20%, and it's no fault of their own, it's just they don't realize it, have directory services set up enough that file servicing and things of that nature will work, but not enough to be able to log in on a Mac desktop with that user. So we have an article on our website that describes how to actually test that and actually how to fix that situation. Sorry, I was a little parched. All storage is shared between users. So access control lists and quotas are probably your best bet to control user access. Let's talk about the sessions a little bit more in detail now. So in a normal environment, we have user consoles connected through a network connection that would connect to the physical server, and the physical server would have storage, memory, processor, graphics, and network hardware themselves. The console itself would be running the operating system and the applications that that user would be running. Now again, we recommend that you leave the console in a logged out state. The console would actually talk to the drivers through IOKit basically and talk to the hardware that way. In our user sessions, the users themselves are disassociated from the hardware because the console is remote. That's the first issue. The second thing is we don't want the users to have access to the actual physical devices themselves. So because of that, we have the Aqua Connect interface handler, which basically handles all communication to the device, which then passes in a uniform form, and then passes it to the remote protocol interface, which is a protocol-specific interface. So RDP would have one, VNC would have one, X11 would have one, and basically those would pass it off. And of course, if we come up with more protocols in the future, they would be passed off from there. So the applications would communicate to this unified interface, and then from there would be handled off into their actual protocol handling, and that would communicate across the network. So server hardware device access is not permitted for each user session. So if you were to plug in some special hardware into the Mac server itself, the remote user sessions would not have access to that. They would basically have access to whatever the ACIH would have, would allow. Printer, disks, etc. can be accessed via OS facilities, so things like network access or file system access or printer access is handled by the CUPS or Samba or HFS Plus or whatever file system you're using, and so therefore they're not direct device access, and therefore they are accessible to the user. They're not accessible directly through IOKit, but to their related infrastructures and frameworks. Local client device access inside a session is allowed but requires OS facilities. Again, articles on our website describe that. Local client audio, scanner, and USB access is not possible at this time. We are working on adding those functionality to the product, but again, we're talking about interfacing a very dissimilar system such as a Mac and a thin client.